This video will cover the last section of Chapter 11 titled The Women's Rights Movement. So, first off, women have been playing a big role in the various movements that we discussed in this chapter, especially the abolitionist movement. So, something to know is that we will also talk about women's involvement in other movements in the future. One that stands out is the progressive movement, which is the latter part of the 1800s into the early 1900s, and we'll get to that in the next unit. But one of the things that you're going to see is that women are going to stick together and going to try to help each other out, especially religious women that felt like it was their duty, it was their responsibility as good Christians to take care of other women. So one of those groups that arises at this time is the Female Moral Reform Society. So their role was basically, or why they started was, they began to see uh, a lot of prostitution, as we discussed in section 2 of this chapter. Women were eventually were part of this prostitution system that was developed in cities. So these women will eventually raise funds to help prostitutes who didn't have homes, helped prostitutes that needed assistance, recovery, get back to civilian life. And they also would go into these brothels and um, sing hymns and do prayer, look for runaway girls who could get caught into the whole prostitution system. And so they were really big on this moral a moral responsibility to end corruption, to end any illicit things. So they focus on women, really helping other women get um, get back on their feet, especially prostitutes who were physically attacked, punished, and so eventually women were helping these women kind of get back into their lives. Another example of this benevolent ideology is Dorothea Dix, who eventually grows up in a well wealthy on her dad's side, still growing up with an abusive parent, with an alcoholic dad. So she really early on, she really pushes for bettering not only her life but bettering the lives of others. She put others before her, used a lot of her money, her inheritance to assist other people. So one of the things that you see her really what she's known for is the establishment of asylums. As she eventually visits prisons, she gets a hold of she realizes and finds out that are actually putting women, men, um, mentally ill individuals with real criminals all in the same jail. So she eventually pushes in different states for the separation, for the creation for a man's prison, a women's prison. Those who were mentally ill, put them in a different facility. So she is known for providing that boost, that support for that movement, and that was crucial for those who were part of the system. And again, her idea was to improve, to make better, right? And the second, a different movement that eventually takes place as well is the uh, movement to bring about public education. Understand that schools and education was part of America, but not in a public setting. Like it was not, there was no public system in the United States. It was more scattered. And so what you see women begin to push for an educational system for the United States. And women really put themselves behind to support Horace Mann, who was a big supporter of public education, and felt that kids need to learn more, and need to the hours in a day should be longer. The days in a year school year should be longer, and again, the recruitment of females is huge because they feel like the best teachers that ones in teachers that can nurture these kids uh, have to be females. And so for a long time, the teaching profession was highly dominated by females. So this is just a pamphlet about the benevolent group that was started, uh, the Female Moral Reform Society, that was created to assist women, or kind of take them away from that life. Dorothea Dix, like I said, a big supporter and reason why asylums began in the United States. She really felt like the mentally ill could not be in the same location with hardcore criminals, and so that's something that she fought for. She felt like that part of the population needed somebody to speak out for them. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement was supported highly by women. Like I said, the abolition movement would have not been so successful if it would not been for the work that women put in. So a couple authors that really pushed the envelope and really helped with the abolitionist movement. First is Harry Jacobs, who is a fugitive slave, who is a mother who eventually became an author and wrote about her experiences, the cruelty, the hardships, challenges that women have to suffer in slavery. Something that didn't happen to men is the constant rape that would happen by the hands of the plantation owner, and eventually retaliation from the wife of that plantation owner for the promiscuous acts that the owner would eventually commit. And so she eventually, Jacobs describes how much hardship, how much struggles she eventually had endured while in slavery, mainly because she was a woman. And a second author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in her book Uncle Tom's Cabin, also depict the profound abuse on women. This moral failing that slavery has brought upon. And so one of the things that you see is that both authors are talking about this great fault, this great abuse that is happening to slaved women in slavery. And then uh, two abolitionists who we talked about before, the Grimke sisters, are going to bring about religion and this holy scriptures to really push forward their agenda on not only anti-slavery but also the duty of women and their responsibility to be equal with men when it comes to civics. So they eventually argued that women themselves, white women in the North, themselves were part of a type of domestic slavery. Domestic slavery meaning that what happens in the home, mainly because at the time, men saw pretty much women as property, like they owned them. Women could not speak in public. Women had basically a role, a position that they eventually had to stay in. They could not speak, like I said, not speak in public. They could not suggest stuff. Everything, all decisions were made by men in the household. So the Grimke sisters are arguing that this is a type of domestic slavery that women are experiencing. And so that's something that you see, right? The two authors are talking about the actual slavery that has taken place, in the South and parts of the North, but the Grimke sisters are saying that domestic slavery also exists for white women they're experiencing the not having rights, not being able to speak out because they're women. And so uh, here's the pictures of the book. Here's Harry Jacobs, and this is the other one by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And again, you can see that, as I mentioned, these two books were instrumental in changing the minds of Northerners on what was going on in the South. As you saw from the previous sections, I talked about when I talked about abolitionists, I talked about how Northerners were still very protective of having just one race, not mixing our races. So you're going to see that this book is going to start to change the mind of many Northerners. And lastly, at the Seneca Falls Convention, women did not meet there to argue about gender roles within our family or labor disputes that they had going on, but more they focused on providing women the right to ownership, to property ownership, mainly securing any property that they entered into a marriage with to make sure that they had it even after if they divorced or they became widows. So one of the things that they really push for is that this declaration of sentiment, this idea that women have the right. It really focused on this Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, focusing on this idea that all Americans are equal. And so they really pushed for this representation, and they really felt that voting was one of the biggest flaws in American history. And so they began really here to discuss the suffrage movement or the right to vote for women. And one of the biggest supporters, leaders of that movement was Susan B. Anthony, who had experience leading movements being part of movements like the abolitionist movement and the temperance movements, which we'll talk about later on. The main idea here in the entire chapter is that you saw the arrival of different movements: abolitionist movement, individualism, transcendentalism, and they all have created some sort of separation or division in the country. As we will know in the next unit, these divisions eventually become very apparent. So one of the things that you need to focus in this chapter is to understand that all these different movements have created division in the United States in their own way. Uh, that those type of movements will be there in when we analyze the separation that will eventually happen um, in the next unit. And like I said, women that were prominent in this in in the movement, the women's rights movement, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. So these are individuals who made a huge push for the women's rights, and really are examples of what women were trying to do to improve their situation in the United States.